everybody, and welcome to Psyched Out, a podcast focused on all things psychology, like psychological thrillers, unethical experiments, true crime, cults, and more. I'm your host, Emily, and for those who don't know, I have a bachelor's degree in forensic psychology and a background in law enforcement. This helps me provide unique insight on some of the world's most famous cases, movies, and events. In today's episode, we'll be talking about the Osage Indian murders. Before we jump in, I do want to apologize for not getting the second part to the Bonnie and Clyde episode up and running. My sister and I ran into some technical difficulties, and then between our two work schedules, we just haven't been able to sit down and record that, but it will be coming. I am working on that, so I will get that out to you guys as soon as I can. Thank you for your patience. I do apologize for that. And I also apologize for this episode coming out a little bit later. Normally I upload on Tuesdays, but I was spending the Labor Day weekend with my family, and so I didn't have an opportunity to record. So you'll be getting it a little bit late, but I hope you understand. I just wanted to spend some time with the family, and I haven't seen them in a couple of months. So that's kind of where I'm at. Now, without further ado, we're going to go ahead and jump into the case. So, in order to further understand the events that take place in this case, I'm going to take you guys on a little history trip, a little journey back in the time machine. We are going to briefly discuss the Osage people and how they ended up in Oklahoma to begin with, because that's not where they're originally from. So, the Osage, who are related to the Omaha, Ponca, Kaw, and Quapaw tribes through language, culture, and tradition, among other things, developed originally in the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys before they ultimately migrated west to the Great Plains. Their ancestors are said to have established themselves as early as 200 to 400 AD. And despite having an extensive history in the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys, the Osage tribe was forcibly relocated by the U.S. government to a reservation in Oklahoma in the 1870s. This was not uncommon if you've looked at the treatment of indigenous people from the American government and the American people. It's not great. It's actually very, very shitty. So this isn't that surprising that they were forcibly relocated. It is a pattern of American history, and it, in my opinion, is a very big stain on our record, one that a lot of people choose not to look at, but something that I feel is very important to this case and is indicative of future behavior on the U.S. government's part. Shortly after the Osage began to establish themselves in their new home, oil was discovered. This took place in about 1897, so about 20 to 30 years after they initially settled. And this oil was specifically found on the Osage Indian Reservation, presently known as Osage County, Oklahoma. As you may have guessed, this was major breaking news, especially back then. They're not going to report on like social media stuff. This was the tip top of every newspaper on the face of America. This was insanely important. And it immediately became a point of interest for all sorts of greedy, just awful human beings, scam artists, etc. Just people that wanted to take advantage of the situation. As we know, oil is a huge part of the global economy, especially at this time. It still is today, and it's where we can see some of the richest people on the planet continue to make their money, mostly through exploitation and questionable business practices. So the fact that the Osage have oil on their reservation is immediately a big concern because, as we know, large entities have no problem asserting dominance over minorities, let alone indigenous peoples. Again, this was not uncommon. Consequently, the U.S. Department of the Interior stepped in to manage leases for oil exploration on Osage land and oil production on the reservation. This was done through the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and the U.S. would later manage royalties, paying allottees to the Osage. Essentially, this meant that each member of the Osage reservation was given 657 acres of the land. This took place in 1907, and this was in part due to Oklahoma preparing to become a state, because remember, like the 50 states as we know it now, that wasn't always a thing. They were integrated over time, and at this point, Oklahoma wasn't part of the U.S. as we know it today. So part of this land distribution was a way to say, hey, here's land. We have people that inhabit this land. We have people that own this land. We can be part of the U.S. government. So that's kind of part of the motivation as to why this ends up shaking out the way that it does. Now, after the Osage have been given their land parcels, they also have land parcels given to their legal heirs, and just about every Osage that I can think of. I think even half-blooded Osage were given these land parcels. So basically, everyone, as I'm understanding it, had land to their name, which is incredible because it's not something that you would see happening today, especially for indigenous people, as sad as it is. Now, these Osage were given what's called head rights and then royalties to the oil production based on their size of allotted land. The head rights that were given could then be inherited by legal heirs, including non-Osage legal heirs. So overall, the tribe as a whole held the mineral rights communally, meaning that every member of the community had a, quote, stake or share in the mineral rights of the land. As a result, the members of the tribe were paid from leases determined by a percentage related to their holdings. My understanding is that basically how much land you held would mean how much money you got. Though I will caveat this sentiment with the fact that some sources say each Osage member was, like I mentioned before, allotted a specific amount of land that was consistent across the board. So like I said earlier, some sources say they each got 657 acres. Others are saying, oh, well, based on the size of the family, this is the amount of land that they were given, or because of the family collectively having 2,000 acres of land or something, this was the percentage that they were given. It gets complicated. So what I suspect happened is that once family members died and the wealth shifted, the predetermined amount of land allotted to individuals changed. So I think both things are kind of true in the end, because if everybody starts out with the same amount, then everybody in the same family has the same amount, but if you die, then your heir gets it, so then your heir has more land, which means they get a higher percentage. Basically, for anybody struggling with the concept that I'm laying out, don't worry, it's okay. It was very, very confusing for me too, and it's still a little confusing. I'll try and break it down with a little bit of math. Math is not my strong suit, so please forgive me. But basically, let's say that, like I mentioned, one family has a collective 2,000 acres or so. This family is made up of, 5 people. You compare that to, say, a single person who doesn't really have any family, and they only have that allotted 657 acres. Then that single person is going to be way less wealthy regardless of what happens to them and their family, because they're only one person in that family. So they have that predetermined set of 657 acres that is never going to change for them. Their wealth is never going to increase. Now, let's say in the family of 5, where I think each person would have 400 acres. Would that make 2,000? I think it does. Each person has 400 acres, but a relative dies off and they're an heir. Then they inherit that land and their average wealth increases along with their total ownership of land. Meaning that in theory, the last heir of the family, let's say the last of the 5, would then consequently inherit all 2,000 acres of that land. Again, comparatively, the single man without family or heirs would still only have 657 acres, and there's nothing that's going to compound his wealth or anything like that. So that's my understanding of what all of this means. Again, I will admit that I know jack shit about oil and land and everything to do with that business, so I could definitely be a million trillion % wrong. And I could possibly just be misunderstanding and misrepresenting this entirely, but this is my understanding of the research that I've done. If you're super educated on this type of thing, please let me know, because I would love you to break it down. I don't want to spread misinformation. I think I'm somewhat correct, but again, this is not my forte. I don't know a whole lot about this. So long story short, they basically struck gold, but it's liquid black gold, and this led to a massive economic boom for the Osage people, as one would expect. So much so that by the 1920s, the Osage people took in, I think it was $30 million which, according to my calculations, would be somewhat equivalent to $363 million as of late 2024, which is an insane amount of money for anybody, let alone an indigenous community. Because, like, if we're being honest, most tribes are left on their own with little assistance from the government or state at all. They are not given a lot of resources for just about anything, which is why poverty is very rampant in these communities to no fault of their own. And they've been pushed around by the government and ignored for a very, very long time. So this was not something people were used to seeing when it came to indigenous communities. So the Osage were now very much an outlier in this, quote, trend of poorness in indigenous communities. Again, it's not their fault. They got so screwed by America and literally everybody else all the fucking time. Again, it is not their fault, but the Osage were an outlier now, and this made them a massive target, like nationwide, even worldwide. In fact, people across the U.S. would ultimately call the Osage the richest nation. Some even posited that the Osage were richer and more powerful than the, quote, white man, which is kind of concerning because white men don't take that sort of sentiment very nicely. They don't like being told that they suck. They still don't like being told that they suck. So you can imagine how that went back then. You may be wondering, though, when they have this kind of wealth, what did the Osage use their wealth for? Well, they got some serious fucking upgrades. They didn't have to live in tents anymore. Some of them got mansions, which, hey, I'm not going to yuck your yum. Go for it, boo. They got cars. They were able to afford just about anything that they wanted. Some used the money to send their children to private schools because they really wanted them to get a better education and kind of avoid a lot of the downsides to public school. Others, like I said, got luxury cars. Some even got expensive clothing, jewelry. Others just traveled across Europe. They did basically whatever they wanted to do, and to be honest, they deserve it. Unfortunately, the joy of this oil boom did not last long, because in order to manage such an oil-rich land, the Osage depended on tens of thousands of oil workers. With an oil boom taking place, they attracted a lot of white opportunists, as one would expect. Some very much had good intentions. They were good people. They were literally just seeking work, business relationships, and just genuine entrepreneurial projects while respecting the Osage people along with the Osage traditions. On the other hand, there were others who were completely and totally fueled by greed and had a desire to own the land of the Osage people outright, come hell or high water. Like, they genuinely did not care about the Osage people for anything. Overall, criminal activity was very quick to root itself in the Osage Nation, but not really from the Osage people. A lot of it came from outsiders. Though I will say that some Osage would later stoop to corruption to support illegal activity by white men, but again, this was an incredibly small percentage of the cancer that was spreading in Osage. And by cancer, I mean white men. Unfortunately, like, crime is crime. Criminals are criminals. Race doesn't have a whole lot to do with it, so it was bound to be that some Osage would unfortunately fall into this crowd, but it is important to note that predominantly it was white men that were committing these crimes. Now, in a barely disguised racist move, the U.S. government passed an act in 1921 that required all Osage members to have their finances managed by a, quote, guardian. If they didn't want to be babysat by a government-appointed person, an Osage would have to prove their competence. As you'd expect, the government set the Osage up to fail because the government was like, oh, here's a whole group of people that we can take advantage of. This is great. Basically, they required the Osage to pass tests, which contained material that the Osage had never learned and were never going to know, which led to a vast majority of them being forced into guardianships because they were incompetent. It wasn't a fair test. It's sort of like what happened with Britney Spears, but with the government instead of, like, your dad. And this is sort of what early conservatories or conservatorships. I probably said that wrong. This is basically what those were very, very early on in the 1920s. And then once a guardian was appointed as the person in charge of this Osage member's wealth, um, they could kind of do whatever they wanted with it. So basically, the government was like, oh no, they're rich. We don't like that because they're indigenous, and that's really fucked up. The indigenous should not be rich. Well, I guess they must be too dumb to handle their finances and all of that money and oil. So, let's make it so that they have to be babysat in order to, use their own money. And we'll just have that babysitter completely and totally run their finances. Then, get this, when the babysitter starts to steal from the person they're supposed to be taking care of, we can just look the other way because it's really not that big of a deal. We're just bettering the white man. And then everyone will think we're so nice for helping these poor, uneducated, indigenous people. I swear we're not racist at all. Wow, you're such a great government. We just love everybody. Yeah, obviously that is sarcasm. If you didn't understand that, I do apologize, but it's very sarcastic. Frankly, the Osage were done an incredible disservice because these legal guardians, as you may have expected, were exclusively, well, not exclusively, almost exclusively white men who then skimmed off the top, stole Osage land, stole their head rights and royalties, or even just straight up murdered the Osage member they were managing just to inherit their wealth. Because yes, the guardians could inherit the wealth of the Osage member they were kind of sponsoring, looking after, totally taking advantage of if that Osage member died. So there's very clearly ulterior motives taking place here. Some guardians would also just go so far as to track what their Osage dependents spent their money on to the point that the Osage individual had to ask permission to buy freaking toothpaste and like toilet paper. It's stupid, Like, oh, you're in charge of my finances. Hey, maybe you don't want to pay for dental care. What if I just buy toothpaste? Like, hey, maybe letting them afford toothpaste will, save some expenses in the long run. Like, the least you could do is let them brush their fucking teeth. But apparently that was not a thing. It was a control issue, and a bit of, not a bit of, a lot of racism. Overall, the entire arrangement became a cesspool for illegal activity at the expense of an indigenous nation. This is the background to our story. I will now be telling you about the wrongfully murdered Osage members, and given the context that I have provided, I want you to think back on the information that was in the last, 10, maybe 15 minutes, and it'll kind of help inform us on who the killer will end up being. So in the early 1920s, it's reported that 18 Osage and 3 non-Osage were murdered within a short period of time, all within Osage County. Obviously, this was a massive point of concern, especially because the Osage population wasn't very high to begin with. This period of time was consequently known as the, quote, Reign of Terror. While some of the victims were unrelated to one another, several of the victims belonged to one specific family, which would ultimately reveal a very sick scheme to basically make it rich as fast as possible. So the first victim was discovered on May 27th, 1921 by local hunters. The hunters stumbled upon the decomposing body of 36-year-old Anna Brown. Her remains were found in a remote ravine of Osage County, and initially authorities ruled her death as an accidental fall. They basically suspected that she'd fallen into the ravine due to alcohol poisoning. Again, this sentiment likely came from the fact that there is a stereotype, which even persists today, that all indigenous people are raging alcoholics. This is not true. It's a stereotype, and they were very quick to just say, yep, we're going to lean into that. She fell off of this ravine because she had drunk, and it's her fault. It was later learned that alcohol poisoning actually had nothing to do with Anna's death, and then when an autopsy was completed, it was revealed that her cause of death was actually a bullet fired into the back of her head. At the time of her death, Anna Brown was divorced, which meant that her royalties and head rights to the land that was hers would ultimately be awarded to her mother, Lizzie Q. Kyle. And then this decision was made in probate court, which is, my understanding, is a type of court that sorts out people's property and rights after somebody dies. So it's basically like kind of to sort out a will or something like that. I'm not super familiar with it because I've never had to manage anything in probate court, but that's kind of my general understanding. And then on the same day that Anna's body was found, her cousin, Charles Whitehorn, was also found deceased, but he had been shot as well, which is again a huge point of concern given the fact that there were two murders and they both belonged to the same family. People were very concerned about this. Thankfully, the two murders can give us somewhat of a loose profile. I made this profile during the infancy of my research for this case, so I didn't know who the bad guy was, if you will. I just kind of knew who had been killed, how they had been killed. So I thought it would be interesting to provide you with what I believe the perpetrator's pathology is, just based off of the initial research I did. And then as the case progresses, we can kind of see how well that fits, if it doesn't fit at all. Keep in mind, profiles are loose guidelines on what to look for or what to expect. They're not 100% accurate. If they are, like, that's freaking insane, but that doesn't happen. So we're going to dive into this a little bit. So with Charles and Anna dead, and given their relation to one another, I think it'd be safe to assume that the killer definitely had knowledge of the Brown family. I mean, it's kind of hard to shake off the fact that they belong to the same family. They both died on the same day from very similar means and methods. And they know the Brown family enough to know extended family such as cousins. This individual would likely be familiar with them. And then this double murder could definitely be indicative of a hate crime, but it'd be strange to target two people from the same family for just a hate crime. I don't really see that happening. That said, I think it's more likely the killer had a specific goal or agenda that pertains to the specific lineage of the Brown family. Whether they feel slighted or indebted to them, it doesn't really matter. Given the callousness of Anna's murder, I also think it's safe to assume that the killer was not attached to her emotionally or anything like that. She was essentially executed and then dumped without a care in the world into a ravine. So, a very, very detached way of killing somebody. To the point where she wasn't really even allowed to see her killer while they were killing her. Again, it was very execution style, straight to the back of the head. The way I see it is the person who executed her likely did it just as a means to an end. Meaning that his goal wasn't sexually motivated or even sadistically motivated like we see in some cases. And then the same goes for Charles' murder. What I think we can expect is that the person who did this is either native or white. The way I see it, they're either part of the community or an outsider. It's good to keep an open mind and have two options. I think sometimes profiles and profilers get a little too nitty gritty and narrow it down too much to one person. So we're going to kind of discuss two possibilities here. Whether they're native or white, there's someone who knows a lot about the Brown family because, as I mentioned, they know Anna and then enough about the family to know her cousin. Now, if they are someone who is part of the community, that would make sense for them to know the Brown family as well as they do, because again, they're part of the community. Now, if they're an outsider, there's a chance that they've studied them from afar and just they're familiar with them and they've, integrated enough into the community to know what they're looking for, who they're observing, and different things like that. Now, someone that would be a direct outsider would likely have more to gain from this than somebody that is part of the indigenous community itself. Especially since most murders fall under the 7 deadly sins. This isn't really a profiling technique, just something that I've noticed over time and developed kind of into a theory. But given the political climate and the abundant wealth here, I'd assume greed had a very big role to play in this. Now, that can still pertain to an indigenous person, within the community that's like, oh, hey, if I kill this family, then maybe somewhere down the line they're an heir and they inherit the wealth. But I would think inherently an outsider would have more to gain from murdering an Osage individual and then gaining financially from that. But I do firmly believe that almost every murder can be chalked up to one, if not more than the 7 deadly sins, whether that's lust, greed, rage, pride. In this case, I very much think that it is greed and probably a little bit of pride, but mostly greed in my opinion. So 2 months after Charles was murdered, Lizzie Q was found dead as well. We're just stepping away from the profile a little bit. Keep that stuff in the back of your mind and kind of what I said, and then we'll go from there. But yes, Lizzie Q was found deceased as well. Authorities originally suspected that she just died of old age, but it was later determined that she was actually poisoned to death. Now, this adds another member in the Brown family to the list of those killed during the Reign of Terror. It also gives us a little more insight on the killer, in the sense that they have to be close enough and familiar enough with Lizzie to poison her without much suspicion. It also solidifies the idea that the killer has something to gain by targeting this specific family. What's interesting, though, is the change in MO. It's not common for someone to de-escalate from shooting people to poisoning them. So that in and of itself is strange and something to take note of. Now, with Lizzie dead, the money she inherited from Anna's death, as well as her own money, would then be passed on to whatever additional heirs there were. It should be noted that Lizzie also had inherited her late husband's wealth, making her incredibly rich. And now that she had died, her heirs would be even more rich than she was. Having 3 deaths on their hands, and all from the same family, the Osage community was reeling. I can't imagine what that felt like or what they were experiencing. They were very afraid and not entirely sure of what to do. I mean, it's probably something they've never experienced before, especially in such a small community. They naturally sought answers, but they didn't really know where to look to get these answers. And in all honesty, like, where do you actually go? Who do you turn to for something like this? Like, most people don't know. Well, in 1922, the Osage ultimately approached a white oilman named Barney A. McBride for help. They basically said, "Hey, this is what's happening. We don't really know what to do." And then after hearing their concerns, McBride ultimately traveled to Washington, D.C., where he attempted to enlist the aid of the federal government on behalf of the Osage people. His goal was to have the murders properly investigated, but unfortunately that would not happen until a little bit later. On the night of McBride's arrival, he actually received an ominous, anonymous telegram, say that 5 times fast, that basically told him, hey, be careful, watch your back. Again, maybe it's a hoax. He wasn't too concerned about it. He went on to play a game of billiards at a nearby club. And then, upon exiting from the club that same evening, an assailant tied a burlap sack around his head. The assailant then stabbed McBride over 20 times, a very brutal and frenzied attack, one that very clearly takes a lot of strength, anger, determination, stamina. Like, it's very hard to stab somebody 20 times. And the following morning, McBride's naked body was found in a Maryland culvert. Again, this is a very different MO, and it's all the way in Washington, on top of that. And it's a murder that takes place, what I would imagine is a very busy area, if it's just right when he leaves the club. I'm kind of confused as to how nobody saw it, and if they did see it, maybe they just said, hey, it's not my monkey, not my zoo type of thing. So, naturally, people were wondering, how is this connected? Well, there is always the possibility that it's not connected at all, and it could just be very unfortunate circumstances, but given the circumstances, I'd say it's, pretty easy to say that it's likely connected. It's, in my opinion, not a coincidence that the one man the Osage reached out to and sent on their behalf to plead for a proper investigation ends up being killed. It was like, The math is mathing, in my opinion, but, some people are like, oh, well, maybe not. My opinion is that it is definitely connected. So, McBride, brutally murdered. Like I said, there is the off chance it's not connected. It's like a really weird coincidence, but again, not really in my opinion. The way I see it is that whoever was responsible with killing McBride was hell-bent on having him murdered to the point that they did insane amounts of overkill. I believe the total amount of stab wounds was actually 22, which is a lot in my standards and most people's standards, most likely. I think, like, one stab wound is kind of a lot in my opinion, but 22 is really going above and beyond expectations. And the way I see it, it either means that someone really, really sucks at their job and then needed to stab him 22 times because they just, I don't know, they're not efficient or something, or they wanted to make sure that this guy was legitimately dead. And then there's a secret third option, which is that someone hated McBride so much that they just had to stab him 22 times to get it out of their system. Like, there's a chance he was dead after 3 stabs, and they were just like, you know what? I really hate this guy. I'm going to stab him 19 more times. And then they did. Regardless, McBride died as a result of his injuries, and because of this, his death has been linked to the Osage murders by quite a few people. Unfortunately, that would mean that all of this happened was because he just tried to do the right thing for a group of people who'd already been victimized enough by society, the government, and white men, and they sought him out as an ally, and he was punished for it. Unfortunately, the murders plaguing the Osage people, as well as their allies, weren't over. One of Anna Brown's cousins, Henry Roan, was also found dead in his car on February 6th, 1923, from a gunshot wound to the head. Again, this is very reminiscent of what happened to Anna and her death, and, like I mentioned before, suggests a very detached killer. Think sort of like a hitman or something like that. You go in, you make a shot, you leave, you get in, you get out. However, Roan's death finally gave law enforcement their first suspect. See, Roan had financial dealings with a man named William Hale. Hale, as you may have guessed, was a sack of human feces. After Roan borrowed about $1,200 from Hale, a wealthy and prominent cattle rancher, also a white man who looks like he has a toddler's face in every picture I've ever seen of him, Hale made himself the beneficiary of Roan's life insurance policies. That's not weird at all. This was done through fraud, as you may have guessed, because some people just don't like to make an honest living without murder and life insurance policies. The policy was for $25,000, which is roughly $465,000 in today's current economy, so definitely a lot of money. More than most of us would know what to do with outside of buying a house today, and even then it probably wouldn't be enough, but I digress. As if the problems in the Osage Reservation weren't bad enough, a bomb blew up Anna's sister's house. Anna's sister being Rita Smith. The bomb exploded on March 10th, 1923, resulting in the death of Rita as well as her servant, Nettie Brookshire. Rita's husband, Bill Smith, would die 4 days later from massive injuries resulting from the blast. Before dying, like the bad bitch he is, Bill pointed the finger at who he suspected the killers were. It was later discovered that the bomb, which claimed an entire family, was composed of 5 gallons of nitroglycerin, which is a big fucking bomb by 1920s standards. Honestly, in my opinion, it's still a big fucking bomb. Because any bomb, in my opinion, is really big. Anywho, Bill was like, hey, I think this Hale guy has something to do with it, and I'm going to point my finger at him before I die, because, you know what, fuck this guy. And I appreciate that, Bill. We love a petty king. If you're going to go out, you might as well point the finger. After this incident, our suspect, Mr. William Hale, appears yet again. Hale took it upon himself to send George Bigheart, the last hereditary Osage chief, on a train to Oklahoma City for a trip to the hospital because he's just that nice. This trip stemmed from an incident of poisoned whiskey. Can you believe it? Well, how did this whiskey get poisoned? You guessed it, good old Mr. Hale. Hale had been appointed as George's guardian due to the fact that he was George's neighbor and apparently a really good friend and a really nice guy. Now, something that's interesting to point out here is the use of poison. Poison, as you may not know, is seen most often with female killers and in cases of comfort oriented killers. If you follow my TikTok or Instagram, you'll know what I mean when I say that because I've talked about it before on there. But in case you don't follow those, let me spell it out for you. A comfort oriented killer is someone who murders for some type of comfort, as you may have guessed, or comfort oriented gain, something that in their mind would make life easier for them, whether that's for money, a house, a jet ski, some other tangible gain. The other thing that has to be considered when it comes to poison is that, as I mentioned earlier, the killer is very familiar with their target. Unless, of course, it's an instance of mass poisoning, like, you dump a bunch of LSD in a water source. That's a bit different. But in isolated incidents, we usually see a spouse or a parent or maybe a sibling poisoning their victim. Maybe even a boyfriend or a girlfriend. Which hints at the fact that in Big Heart's case, he was poisoned by someone close to him. And who was his legal guardian at the time? You guessed it, good old Mr. Hale. So it's starting to make a little bit of sense. Now, following the poisoning attempt, Big Heart called white attorney William Watkins, known as W.W. Vaughn. Big Heart asked Vaughn to come to the hospital where he was staying. Big Heart's request is said to be basically just an outright plea that he, I really, really want this meeting. I have some information that's going to be super important. So Vaughn was like, you know what, dude? I got you. He goes to the hospital, and both men met that night once Big Heart arrived. And Big Heart said he had suspicions about who was behind the murders in Osage. Big Heart went so far as to say that he had access to incriminating documents that would ultimately prove his suspicions. You probably know who he was pointing the finger at. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. Following this meeting, Vaughn boarded a train of his own to travel to Pawhuska. In the morning, Vaughn was nowhere to be found when the train porter came to wake him up. Dude was just walking down the train like, wow, I gotta go wake up Mr. WW. Let him know that we're just about there. But Vaughn's bed was perfectly made and completely undisturbed. So he hadn't even slept there at all, which is very concerning. Vaughn's body was consequently found completely naked by the side of the train tracks just 5 miles from his destination. Vaughn's skull was also crushed in, like brutally crushed in, and the incriminating evidence that was provided to him by Big Heart was mysteriously missing. In fact, Vaughn's body was so badly beaten that the coroner was unable to determine a cause of death. He speculated that basically two situations could have happened where Vaughn may have been beaten before being pushed off the train, or alternatively, he had fallen off first and then been beaten up after. Ultimately, because of the circumstances, Vaughn's death was ruled as suspicious. And then, in an interesting coincidence, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, it is not so interesting or nor of a coincidence, Big Heart would pass away at the hospital that same morning as a result of the poisoning. Aside from these specific murders, all of them tied back to the Brown family. And then there were 13 other murders that also took place in Osage, where white lawyers and businessmen inherited the money of their Osage dependent, because remember, prominent white people were getting Osage heir rights by being their guardian. And then they were like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if we just killed the person and so we could get all of their money because we're awful, evil humans of flaming garbage? Anywho, suspicion grew as more than 60 Osage deaths occurred, which is an insane amount to think of in such a small community. But again, unfortunately, I'm not really that surprised. It was later discovered that a low-level market for contract killings was operating in Osage to allow white guardians to inherit Osage wealth through the murder of their dependent. This would make sense given the way that Anna died, as well as her relatives. It would also make sense for a wealthy white man to hire contract killers, give them some of the wealth as payment, while consequently distancing themselves from the crime itself, making it less likely that they would be caught. And wouldn't you know it, Hale took full advantage of the available criminal syndicate. The Osage Tribal Council, fed up with local corruption and desperate to protect their people, sought help from the Department of the Interior. The Department of the Interior sent 4 undercover agents to investigate Hale and local crime. And throughout a 2-year investigation, it was discovered that Hale was operating a crime ring and had earned the title, quote, King of Osage. That in and of itself, in my opinion, is pretty freaking incriminating. But how did Hale manage to come up with a big scheme to get rich as quickly as he did? Well, one of his nephews, Ernest Burkhart, was married to Molly Burkhart, the last surviving member of Anna Brown's family. As mentioned earlier, all of Molly's family has been shot, blown up, or poisoned. But Hale's scheme extended far beyond what you'd expect. In fact, he actually convinced Ernest to marry Molly so they could systematically kill her relatives, kill her, and then inherit all of the wealth since she was a full-blooded Osage. Hale then arranged for the murder of Molly's relatives, intending to wipe out the entire family, compound their wealth, and then inherit it. While investigators continued to examine the deaths of Anna's family and associated Osage members, they learned that Molly was also being systematically poisoned. But Ernest's latest attempt to poison her was unsuccessful. After the constant tragedy in Molly's family, she actually confided in her Catholic priest that she thought she was being poisoned, and he encouraged her to avoid all alcohol and alerted investigators on Molly's behalf. So thank you, Mr. Priest, for looking out for good old Molly here. And thankfully, Molly actually survived. She made a prompt recovery where she consequently divorced Ernest. Hashtag get fucked Ernest, you deserved it. And in all honesty, I'm very glad that her lineage wasn't completely wiped out and that she survived, because the thought of a single man eliminating an entire family tree for financial gain is terrifying and fucking diabolical. But I will say Molly, regardless, experienced an immense amount of loss and grief, given the fact that she was the sole survivor of her family. But I am happy, like I said, that she was still able to carry on her family name and their memories. Now, investigators were ultimately able to secure convictions on Hale and his nephew, as well as some of their other associates, but only after countless hung juries, testimony from bribed individuals, and then other misconduct from Hale, lawyers, and then other legal officials. Basically, like, everybody was getting bribed, everybody was being intimidated, some people were being killed. It was a huge clusterfuck that led to numerous hang-ups in Hale's convictions and Ernest's convictions. As for Vaughn and Big Heart's murders, the investigation was never completed, so nobody knows legitimately who did it, but it's likely somebody that was in connection to Hale and Ernest, if not Hale himself. Ernest would later become a state witness against his uncle, stating that Hale had hired a professional criminal, Asa Ace Kirby, to commit the killings of the Brown family. Asa had died before the investigation even took place and was unable to provide testimony, so unfortunately we're not really going to know anything from his point of view, but that's okay because he sounds like a piece of garbage, and I am glad that he did not get to kill anybody else. Unfortunately, Hale, his nephews, and another associate were all granted parole, despite massive protests from the Osage people. As one would expect, Ernest, a repeat offender, would remarry and then rob an Osage woman with his new wife. They robbed her of $7,000. That would be equivalent to about $160,000 today. As if that wasn't bad enough, in 1966, Ernest applied for a pardon, stating that his cooperation with the investigation was reason enough that he should be pardoned. And then in a very stupid-ass decision, the Oklahoma Parole Board voted 3-2 in favor of a pardon, which was granted by Governor Henry Bellman. When I was researching this, I kind of wish that you guys could just see how bad I rolled my eyes, because this is like the dumbest thing I think I've ever heard of. I don't really understand how you can just pardon a guy for aiding and abetting murder and actively plotting to kill an entire family because he, I don't know, supposedly helped you convict his uncle. Like, it just seems weird. Because yes, in modern cases, deals can be made. We see it all the time. But you don't make deals like that after you've confessed and after you've been convicted of very serious crimes. You typically do that shit beforehand. But that didn't happen here. And then, big shocker, Ernest, like Hale, was a white man. And we all know how that goes, especially back then. So, yeah, he got pardoned. It's baffling, and I don't really have a lot of words for it. Yeah. Overall, there were countless other white men involved in the killings that had been hired by Hale. Unfortunately, some people hired by Hale were also Osage members. Like I mentioned earlier, they were a very, very small percentage. Primarily, it was just a bunch of white men that were taking advantage of a group of people who had already been used and abused by just about everybody in existence. Overall, the entire investigation revealed that Hale and his accomplices were directly responsible for up to 20 murders of Osage individuals, outside of their intentions to completely annihilate the Brown family. Long story short, Hale is very much a flaming sack of shit who used his racism and greed to justify the murders of 20 people. His nephew Ernest is equally disgusting, along with Hale's other co-conspirators. They suck, and I am glad that they are probably rotting in hell. Overall, I think the Osage people were done a massive disservice by a very racist government that exacerbated, allowed, and enabled white men to take advantage of them. And for that, I am very sorry. I know my words don't mean a whole lot because there's not much I can do to change that, but I recognize the injustice and disservice that was done to these people, and it should be infuriating for you guys just as much as it is for me. Frankly, the Brown family and many others in the Osage reservation deserved way, way better than what ended up happening to them. If things had been handled differently, I don't believe this ever would have been a problem or it ever would have happened. But unfortunately, it did, and there's not much we can do to change it. If anything, this case portrays a portion of American history that some people want to forget. They want to push the narrative that we are just good people all the time and we're heroes and we save the world, but that's not true. America has done some very fucked up things, and it's important to acknowledge that and know that our history is spotted. We are not this perfect nation that's never done anything wrong ever. We have made mistakes, and it's important to learn from them so that we don't make the same mistakes over and over and over again. So while some people don't really want to acknowledge this side of history, I do. I think it's important, and that's why I'm talking about it, so that hopefully other people can be educated on the fact that, like in this case with the Osage, they were done a very big, systematic, governmental influenced disservice that affected them for a very long time and led to the murder of 60 people, probably more, that just weren't reported. Again, like I said, acknowledging America's wrongs and missteps can also help us understand why relationships with minorities are so strained. Because frankly, the Osage people didn't owe us their land. They didn't owe us their money. They didn't owe us their oil. But we felt entitled to it anyways for a reason that I don't understand. And they had every right to inherit the wealth that they had on their land that they had, by the way, been forcibly relocated to. The government was like, oh shit, that could have been ours. Well, too bad. You made these people leave where they were originally from. Let them keep what it is that's on the land you're forcing them to live on that they didn't want to be on in the first place. It makes me mad. It's ass backwards. I don't understand it. But unfortunately, everything that happened because it was allowed to happen by the government. Frankly, we owe the Osage people and just about every indigenous person on the face of the earth a lot. And the fact that they don't ask for much more than, having their land back and things like that. And we make fun of them all the time. It's just a little mind-boggling. But at the very least, they deserve a sincere apology for what happened. I don't know. I doubt they'll ever get that. I didn't see anything that said that the government ever formally apologized. I don't see that happening. But I will say that I am glad in the end there were enough honest, good-hearted investigators involved with what was going on that they properly put an end to the reign of terror that was taking place with the Osage people. Very shit sandwich for them. I don't really know how they're doing now. hopefully very well. I'll have to look into that because I'm actually pretty curious. But that is the story of the Osage Indian murders. I don't have much else for you guys. I just, it was a case that I felt like I really needed to share because it was definitely something I didn't know of at all until very recently. I had actually been looking for some of the some bigger cases focused on minorities because those are stories that don't get shared a lot. Jeffrey Dahmer and freaking Ted Bundy get shared left and right, and frankly, I don't really give a rat's ass about either of them. They can go fuck themselves. I know they're both dead, but whatever. I don't want to beat a dead horse. I want to talk about stories that deserve to be talked about. So that's why I picked this one, and I think it does a good job of highlighting that the government really screwed the Osage people over, and they didn't deserve it, and it led to a lot of death and murder that could very well have been avoided. So that's that. If you guys didn't know, I am available on Instagram and TikTok and YouTube. Just look up Psyched Out. I think on Instagram and TikTok it's official.psychedout.podcast. And then on YouTube it's just Psyched Out. I will be posting video essays, which is basically the podcast. You just get to see my face. If that's something that you want to see, you can head on over there. Don't forget to subscribe so you guys get updated when new videos drop, whether that's on Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, all that jazz. And in the meantime, stay safe, stay diligent, and stay psyched out.